victory for dialogue and peaceful resolution.
I'm looking forward to the meeting. Obviously, this is very important.
Efforts today between Ottawa, BC, and the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs to move forward. But the political challenges for this federal government are far from over, especially after a week where its priorities of the environment, energy projects, and reconciliation have continued to clash.
What's good for Canada is to create common ground in which we recognize that the environment and the economy must go hand in hand.
He has a balanced approach. He's failing on the environment and he's failing to get jobs built. So congratulations.
So is balance possible? How can the federal government reconcile these priorities moving forward? It's Thursday, and I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, Althea Raj is in Ottawa, and Jason Markusoff is in Edmonton tonight. Good to see everybody. So I know this meeting is happening between the hereditary chiefs and the government, but I want to talk more about where the government is on those big issues over the past few weeks, where they've had to see, those three priorities collide. And how the Prime Minister and how the government has done with trying to balance all those things. Let me start with you on this, Andrew.
I guess you'd say not well. I mean, it was a tricky proposition, but a doable one, which is that you were going to balance not just the environment and the economy, but also reconciliation. So it's sort of a three-cornered act. But you're always going to be distrusted by people on all sides in these types of things. The middle ground can be treacherous ground. And while that's partly a function of people's irascibility or their unwillingness to compromise. It also is the part and parcel of the job of the leader to try and find that middle ground and to convince everybody that you are that middle ground. And I think part of the problem is that through successive missteps, they've allowed each side at one point or another to decide these guys really aren't on the level, they really aren't trying to balance some things, they're just on the other guy's side. And we now have the situation whereas there are lots of people who would like to occupy that middle ground, the debate's being dominated by the extremes now.
Chantal, do you think that this is, the compromise is possible and that the government doesn't know how to get there, or that it's more like what Andrew's talking about?
Well, the problem of the government, beyond all that Andrew spelled out, which I happen to agree with, is that they are trying to find balance between energy and the environment, to name those two, at the time when a clock is ticking and when public opinion is moving and becoming more mobilized on the climate change front. So that middle ground is there, but it is up to a point shrinking. And the government has tried to straddle that fence. It was spared this week having to make a call on the tech mine, and probably lucky for it, because there is no consensus on where the balance is, even within the government. Yeah. Add to that the fact that there is no consensus within First Nations and Indigenous communities either. And you have the elements of a mix that is increasingly difficult to make into a whole.
Althea, do you think that the government sort of raised expectations too high in terms of where it could find this middle ground that seems so elusive?
No. But I think it required perhaps more over communication on this front than we have seen. I think there was a lot that the government just took for granted that people would understand, that they would say no to Northern Gateway, but they would say yes to Keystone. Trans Mountain, that they would even go so far as to purchase the pipeline. And on the purchasing of the pipeline, they did start communicating, but they almost kind of seemed to have forgotten that other part of the equation they talked about during the 2015 campaign, the idea of a social license. And what we're seeing more and more is that grand bargain, that consensus building that Andrew and Chantal are talking about, is being dominated by parties that don't want to give an inch away, that are seeing this as like a zero-sum game. And I think that speaks to kind of a polarizing that we're seeing around the world, frankly. But instead of over-communicating to bring people together and to explain what that grand bargain means and how everybody might have to lose a little to gain a little, that hasn't happened yet.
So where you are, Jason, then, how, I mean, is the notion that a balance between those three corners, as Andrew calls it, is that even something that people are willing to contemplate, or are they not at this point even really listening to the federal government? And I'm generalizing. I know the province is different, but you know what I mean. The provincial government, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I think, say in Alberta, there's increasingly more purchase for the idea that Alberta should act more firmly on climate change than much firmer than Jason Kenney wants. But much of the province is used to the way things had been, that finding the balance meant figuring out the reconciliation and the climate change stuff eventually, but approving the oil sands project, keeping going on the project. And that was a policy, not just, a practice not just by the Conservative government under Harper, but also past Liberal governments and everybody else. So they're just they're still used to this. The challenge that both sides all sides wind up facing on this is that, Trudeau wants to find a middle, but he actually doesn't know where that middle is and has trouble articulating where that middle is. And so when that happens, you have both sides pushing him to try to land closer to their side. When it comes down to, what seemed like it might have been a popularity vote, or just a vote in a firm debate within cabinet on what actually was it, particularly the middle, on how much more oil sands mining to allow to develop. It's no wonder that a company just has no idea where things are going to land and wants to save some face by pulling their project.
Chantal,
to add two things. There should be no illusion that a government of another stripe would have an easier ride of getting projects done, or doing Indigenous reconciliation, or finding a way to get Indigenous communities on side with projects. That's obvious. But we talked after the last election about how climate change had become a top of mind issue for a lot of voters. It drives votes. One of the results of that is that a lot of Liberals who campaigned in the last election narrowly won their seats against people who were willing to outbid them on climate change. So it's now become a ballot box issue. That's probably good, but it also means that the people who are sitting in the House of Commons on the government side are thinking, if we don't do well on this, we're going to go down.
Particularly in a minority government. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
What people on all sides of these multiple issues, I think, have got to take on board is you are not going to win. And I think that's what's driving this, is everybody thinks they can win a total victory. Yeah. The hardline environmentalists say we can just shut in the oil sands tomorrow. The hardline anti-climate change people say, oh, it's all just a hoax. Some people say we can police 5,000 miles of railway and prevent any demonstrations. Or some people think that we can just wave away Canadian claims to territorial sovereignty. None of these things are going to happen. Everybody's got a kind of a veto here. And, they often say that civil wars only end when all sides are kind of exhausted. And maybe that's what has to happen here, is that people have to finally, after we fought about this for a long time, people have to realize they're not going to win. No matter how righteous their side may be, they're going to have to accept they're not going to get total victory.
That sounds logical, Jason. I mean, at some point, everybody sort of will have to bend on something. But is it something that you can see happening under a Jason Kenney government?
I mean, Jason Kenney, again, is very firmly, he's really staked himself on oil, so much so that he's now seems to be willing to actually invest government money in purchasing an oil company, creating an oil company. And this is Jason Kenney we're talking about, who is, the most conservative guy and doesn't believe in such statist socialist matters. It's challenge. I mean, the challenge for Trudeau is that, he has, on one side, he has the Conservatives offering the moral clarity that Andrew Coyne rightly criticizes, and the other side he has the NDP, Green Party, and Bloc offering moral clarity on the other side. You can look like a moderate if you just take a middle ground. But at this point, it just seems like he's indecisive, Trudeau, of figuring out where exactly to land in between those. And that's not a good look.
Okay, Althea, last 30 seconds to you.
Well, I think it just speaks to an absence of leadership. Like, you can't be a cheerleader for your side, or at least the Prime Minister should not be a cheerleader for any side. I mean, he does not play the role, and frankly, I don't think that Jason Kenney should be a cheerleader for a side either. I think he should be acting as a leader. What we're seeing is that the politics, to Chantal's right, very clearly say where the Liberal Party should go. But I think he also needs to explain to those potential voters that, and the budget is a great opportunity for the Liberal government to come out and say, a lot of emissions come from buildings and transportation, and we're going to focus on this as well. It's not just the big bad oil sands that are going to have to pay a price.
Today marks the first deadline for Conservative Party leadership hopefuls, and after much talk over who was not running, we now know who is, at least until the next deadline. So, do we actually have a race?
Welcome back to another round of At Issue. Chantal, Andrew, Althea, and Jason all here tonight to talk about the race that, I don't know. I feel very meh about it so far. I hope it gets more interesting. I assume that it will. Chantal, what do you make of whether this is going to be the race I think that the Conservative Party needs?
What we know as of today is that there's no big star waiting in the wings, secretly signing up members to shake things up. So it's, Erin O'Toole, Peter MacKay, leading candidates, Marilyn Gladu as possible leading candidate too, and a lot of people who don't have really national profiles running again. I think we will really know seriously the shape of that campaign after the next deadline in March, when people who want to run actually have to come up with a lot more money and a lot more signatures. I suspect the names we have today on your board will not all be on the next board for the debates.
Althea, what do you think of where we're at?
Well, this may not be the race the Conservative Party needed, but it's the race the Conservative Party designed. And it's so restrictive that basically the candidates are not being asked to appeal to anybody that basically isn't already a party member. You only have 6.5 weeks, almost 7 weeks to sell party memberships. The deadline is April 17th. The debates don't even happen until April 17th and April 23rd. So you're already talking to people that have purchased a Conservative Party membership. You're not trying to encourage more people to come into the party fold by exposing them to all of your candidates and saying, hey, we have a message that resonates with you. Come join us. And we're already seeing that, frankly. We're seeing the party tack far more to the right, even I would argue, more to the right than they tacked in the last election campaign, where I think the message, at least public opinion polls suggested and the poll on election day suggested, that wasn't the message that voters wanted to hear. And instead, you're seeing Peter MacKay become, follow Erin O'Toole's lead, and Erin O'Toole is becoming more, I would say, hard right. Is that the race that the Conservative Party needed? I don't know. That will be up to members to decide, but it is a very restrictive race for sure.
Yeah, it's certainly not the race that would grow the base in a general, Andrew, but maybe that's not important at this stage. I don't know. Maybe people really aren't paying attention.
Well, I favor leadership races, if you're going to have leadership races rather than the caucus choosing it, that are for the people who are actually devoted and committed to the party rather than glorified membership drives. I think parties get themselves in trouble time and time again when they do that. But I agree. Look, this may well boil down to Peter MacKay and Erin O'Toole, neither of whom are particularly representative of where the party is. So yeah, you're seeing them both posturing and trying to pander to that base, but mostly because they know that they're not really of that. They're not really representative of the small C conservative strain of the party right now. So they're kind of having to do this kind of performance. And I'm not sure anybody's particularly persuaded. I think there's a lot of dismay and boredom in the party that this is the options they've been presented, rather than people with really strong ideas and a willingness to actually propose major changes in the way the country's governed. You're getting this kind of raw meat stuff being thrown out so that they don't have to commit to very much.
Jason, you're watching it from there. What do you make of it?
I was at an Erin O'Toole event last night in just south of Edmonton, and I was stunned at how pale and old the crowd was. They're barely trying to bring in new blood at this point. That'll be for the election. These are just trying to get the hardened volunteers, the hardened donors in. And I also look at this in comparison to what we're watching south of the border with the Democratic primary, and how extensively those candidates are being vetted, battle tested, having debates among each other, really thrashing out. We're learning who they are. With this system they're doing. They're not going to offer any of the up-and-comers some opportunity to debate unless they're verified and get their $300,000, which is a very tall order. And the risk of that is that somebody's going to come out of this, Erin O'Toole or Peter MacKay or whoever else, is going to come out of this process not being battle-tested, not being vetted. And we saw that with Andrew Scheer. Andrew Scheer came out of that much longer, much more expansive leadership campaign, and nobody knew who he was. It wasn't until last October that we knew he was half American or part American, for crying out loud. And that is to the party's detriments, at least in the States. You know, if it's Sanders or Bloomberg or Biden, they're going to be war tested. They're well defined, and there's not going to be opportunity for liberals or anybody else to find out their big flaws.
While I don't want to do a Democratic primary, and I'm not sure anyone in Canada wants to do that, I wonder if there is some merit to the argument that Jason's making about whether a leadership race should be about testing people, testing ideas, thrashing out these things inside a party so that the party emerges not only with a candidate that's been tested, but also with ideas that might be different. Andrew, you want to have a go on that?
Yeah, I mean, it helps, first of all, if people have ideas. And the front runners in this race have been in politics for many years between them, and I don't think many people could say very much about what they stand for other than the general liking for the military.
Law and order.
So it depends why you get into politics, first of all, whether you're there because you have a particular philosophy and ideas you'd like to enact, or just because you think people like you should run things. But beyond that, yeah, the leadership race is where you kick the tires, where you really test them because they're being tested by their fellow candidates in close quarters. Having lots of debates is certainly one good way of doing that. Debates have proven themselves, when they're run properly, to be ways in which to really, make people think on their feet, and they can often be revealing in that way. This race seems designed to keep things much safer than that.
What do you think, Chantal? How much of that will we get here, if any?
I'm trying to think of how much of that did we get in any leadership campaign recently. And my mind goes kind of blank. I wouldn't call Justin Trudeau's walk to the Liberal leadership a big test of ideas. Certainly the NDP did not kick Jagmeet Singh's tires very hard on his way to a first ballot victory. And Stephen Harper dominated the field when he ran for the Conservative leadership. But at this point, there are issues that this party should address. It could have won the last election. It could win the next one. And I don't think the leadership campaign is going to get it to that. That's going to happen afterwards. And it's a minority government. So the Conservatives, again, seem to be hoping that Justin Trudeau will fall apart on his own.
Let me put forward an idea that the leadership, I don't want to go down another path here, but the leadership race in the NDP after Jack Layton, there was a lot of kicking of tires there, actually. A lot of different ideas, and they tested.
And the Stéphane Dion Liberal leadership race.
Yep, that's true. Okay,
and they both did poorly.
Yeah.
So
we've just disproved our point. Althea, do you?
Yeah, well, I was going to add, I actually think the last Conservative election, Conservative leadership race, did expose the candidates pretty well. I mean, it was lengthy. We learned a lot about what Kelly Leitch stood for and what she didn't stand for, what Stephen Blaney stood for, what he didn't stand for. We learned Rick Peterson wants a 0% corporate tax. We learned a lot about Maxime Bernier's ideas. We didn't learn that much about Andrew Scheer.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
and many of his policy ideas he ended up deleting from his website and trying to pretend he had never suggested such things and denounce them before the general election started. But I do think that there were so many debates, official and non-official, local writing associations having debates, that people had a chance to express themselves. And the Liberal leadership race when Stéphane Dion won on the Green Shift also was many, many months. And you had a chance, and the Thomas Mulcair leadership race as well was quite lengthy. Because this one is so short, you will not have a chance to hear that much about the candidates. That being said, if there's only like 2 or 3 people by the time March 26 rolls around, then probably we will learn a fair bit about them.
They'll
be forced to. I mean, at the moment they can have websites with nothing on them, but
last word to you there, Jason.
But I'm not sure. I mean, the media is going to get cranky and ask them. But I mean, given how much interest there is now, who's going to exactly force them? I mean, look at Peter MacKay's website right now. It has his bio on one page, and that's the only piece of information you'll find about. You'll find nothing about his ideas, nothing about his policies.
I think he tweeted yesterday there was policy coming. To be fair, I think I saw that tweet yesterday.
Well, with
3 months to go, we'll hear lots from him in that. And,
we're hearing what he's not in favor of.
Yes, no, we certainly are. But if it's a race about
not
what people don't want to do, I'm not sure that's entirely inspiring
I don't know.
either.
It sounds classically conservative the way they were running last election, though.
Okay. All right. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all. Thanks for being here as a special guest, Jason. Appreciate it. And thanks to the three of you.